Greetings, my friends. Welcome to the third in my series of recreations of the Metropolitan Railway in Buckinghamshire around 1900. This is a one-to-one layout built using Transport Fever 2 and based on the Ordnance Survey Map revision of 1898. Today we travel on a line that's had several names but is best known as the Brill Tramway. The Met began running trains on the Brill Tramway in 1899. It had been built in 1871 by the Duke of Buckingham, of whom more later. I've set this recreation roughly at the time of the takeover, but before any rebuilding or rebranding by the Met had taken place. A quick note on the rolling stock. The railway had two 060 tank locomotives made by Manning Wardle of Leeds. One was built in 1894 with a cab for the drivers, and one in 1876, which was exposed to the elements. And the model I'm using here is as close as I can get to the real thing based on photographs at the time. Now, they also had about a dozen decrepit goods wagons that were not allowed to be worked on any other railway for safety reasons, and two passenger carriages bought in 1895, plus one borrowed from the Met. Passenger trains usually comprise just one carriage with a few goods wagons tacked on. They ran 2 or 3 passenger services a day each way on the 6 miles, 10 kilometres from Brill to Quainton Road, plus goods trains as required. And this went up to 4 passenger services a day when the Met took over. Well, it's time for our train to go, so we will start the train up and we will get into the cab view and leave Quainton Road from our dedicated bay platform, leaving the main Metropolitan line behind us, and we're now heading westward towards Brill. This is a single track all the way without signals, but there was a token system used when more than one train was operating at any time to ensure that only one train could run on any one section. We are approaching the first of a couple of unmanned level crossings. The Brill tram trains had to stop and a member of the crew get out, open the gates, then they drive the train through, and then the crew member would close the gates and catch the train up. In Transport Fever 2, the opening and closing of the gates of course happens automatically by a sort of magic. In the early days, it was quite difficult for them to obtain water for the locomotives, and the 1880s were years of drought. There are stories of confrontations with a farmer near Quainton when trains stopped to take water from ponds conveniently close to the track. The Ordnance Survey Map shows 2 large ponds, one either side of the track, and I'm confident that this, where we are now, was the site of the trouble. To obtain a licence to carry passengers, railways were supposed to run trains at an average speed of at least 12 miles an hour. Well, the Brill Tramway was not designed for speed, so I have made this the maximum. And this is the speed that we're currently travelling at. This means the full journey on this Transport Fever 2 layout takes just over 30 minutes. A later Metropolitan timetable actually shows a 40-minute journey time, which, if you allow a couple of minutes to stop the train at each station and time for the crew to work the unmanned level crossings, is consistent. Following a rebuild by the Met in 1910, trains were permitted to run at up to 25 miles an hour, or 40 kilometres an hour. But whether the journey time came down significantly, I don't know. We are moving through the lush farmlands of the Vale of Aylesbury, then as now studded with farms in all directions, and just about everybody in the area would have worked directly on the land. We're approaching our first stop, which is at Waterston Station. It was little more than a halt with a goods yard attached. You'll see a big house facing the station. This was called Rag Hall, and it's still there today. The station is built where the main Aylesbury to Bicester Road crosses the track, really coming down from the village of Quainton. Today it's the A41. This was the nearest station on the Brill Tramway to the village of Waterston, but it was nevertheless a good mile and a quarter from the village centre, and it was renamed Waterston Road in 1922, which is a little less misleading. Waterston Manor, on the hill to our left, was built between 1874 and 1889 for Baron Ferdinand de Rothschild in the style of a French chateau. Queen Victoria visited in 1890. The manor was given to the National Trust in 1957 and is very well worth visiting. It's built with about 250,000 locally made bricks, which were largely transported by the Brill Tramway. However, Waterston Station was not used as the depot for this building. Instead, a siding came off the tramway a little further on after the station, just about somewhere round the other side of this house of Rag Hall. And it went across the fields as far as was possible. This was called the Winchenden siding, but there's no trace of it on the 1898 Ordnance Survey Map, so I've not put it on this layout. Unfortunately, you can't see Waterston Manor at all from the ground here. It's entirely surrounded by trees at the top of the hill. We're now approaching the village of Westcott. Look out on the left for a disused siding which runs down to a gasworks, and the chimney of the gasworks is visible in the middle distance on the left. This gasworks was built for Waterston Manor, but apparently it was never used, and there was no other reason to work the siding. So not long after this, it was removed entirely. Coming into Westcott, today it has a population of about 450 people, probably a bit less in 1898. We caught a glimpse of the church in the centre of the village as we approached, Church of St Mary the Virgin. But today, an airfield and a business park cover what used to be the farmland to the west of the village. That's the farmland directly in front of us behind the level crossing. And those developments have partially obliterated where the railway used to run. Here's the siding to the gasworks, which of course is no longer in use, which is why the rails have gone rusty. Westcott, like Waterston, just has the one little siding to service the local farms. Here the level crossing would be operated by the station manager, so the crew don't have to get out. As we trundle gracefully across the farmland towards the next village, which is Wootton, we can talk about the history of the railway. It was best known as the Brill Tramway, but it was originally built as the Wootton Tramway. And it was also known for a time as the Oxford and Aylesbury Tramroad, and then the Brill branch of the Metropolitan Railway. And I think perhaps to some in the area it was also known as the Quainton Tramway. The railway was originally a true tramway, that is a light railway system designed for horse-drawn operation only. The Duke of Buckingham wanted to connect the farms and industries on his estates, through which we are currently travelling, to the national network, and built it in 1871, almost entirely over his own land, using workers from his estates, but calling in professional track layers to put the rails down. It began by covering just the 3 miles from Wootton to Quainton Road, which is why it was called the Wootton Tramway to begin with, but it very quickly got extended 3 miles westward to finish near Brill, a substantial village on the way towards Oxford. After a while they upgraded it a bit to allow light locomotives, and they put small banks of raised earth at each station for the convenience of passengers, and these became proper platforms. They would have been wooden platforms later on. It thus became a sort of proper railway licensed to take passengers, although the numbers were always small. And for a time they used to use their locomotives for goods and horses for the passenger services. So it meant it could take about an hour and a half to travel the full 6 mile length of the line, which is really hardly a practical way to run a passenger service. However, with the prospect of an extension to Oxford, which I'll talk some more about later, they made further improvements and they ended the use of horses except for the shunting of wagons in sidings. And those improvements cut the travel time to about the 40 minutes. I'll say more about the Oxford extension later on, as I said. We're approaching a part of the railway called the Wootton Curve, where the railway bends for what seems no obvious reason right around the village of Wootton, or around the lands near Wootton, and I can only assume this was done to keep it well away from land that the Duke of Buckingham didn't want sullied by the passage of the trains. In the middle distance to our left, you can see a church and some houses on a hill. This is the village of Ashenden. The Ordnance Survey Map, which I've based this layout, is a scale of 25 inches to the mile. It shows every section of the railway, every road, every stream, and every field boundary. And it comes on the internet courtesy of the National Library of Scotland, who also provide a transparency overlay of modern satellite images, which show that the vast majority of field boundaries haven't changed at all in the last 130 years. So I have based the layout of all of the fences and the hedges that you see here on those field boundaries. What I don't know is what was actually in the fields, so I've guessed that it was a mixture of arable, of dairy farming, and possibly just pastures to grow grass to turn into hay. You can see on the extreme right the church of All Saints, which is in the middle of Wootton village. And we are nearing the station, which you can see even from here is a long way from the village. Now, I think the station was put here because it's close to the junction of two roads that meet nearby. One goes to Ashenden, the other to the small spa town of Dorton, which is way over in the distance to our left. So this was a very clever spot to put a goods depot, not at all convenient for the residents of Wootton, as you'll see a little bit later on. And amazingly, there used to be a second station here. We're right in the middle of nowhere, but a second station was built. This was built by the Great Central Railway. Relations between the Metropolitan Railway and the Great Central Railway had become strained, even though at the time the Great Central was building a link to join the Met at Quainton Road. So in 1899, to be independent of the Met, the Great Central built a spur that started from their own tracks just north of Quainton. It went across the Brill Tramway by a bridge, which would be just somewhere in front of us. I'll show you exactly where when we get there. And it went on to join the Great Western Railway at Prince's Risborough. And they also built a line going straight from the Great Western Railway at Northolt to Neasden, where they had their own tracks running down to their terminus at Marylebone. This gave them their own line to London without any reliance on the Met. In fact, the bridge that they built over the Brill Tramway is here at this point. They also built a station at Wootton, as I say, in 1906, and it was just down the road here where you can see those cows in that field. And neither of these stations was ever busy, so the one station master used to be in charge of both stations, used to run up and down the road as required. That station was closed in 1953. Coming into Wootton Station, it's got two sidings and had a sort of a variety of wooden sheds to act as booking offices and waiting rooms. And you can see on the left we have a footpath, and this is the path that leads up towards the village. It wasn't a road, it was just a path. It was probably very muddy and quite difficult to traverse, I should think, if it was wet in winter, and it certainly wouldn't have been lit. As we leave Wootton Station, I want to say a little bit about the Kingswood Branch, because this little railway, the Brill Tramway, actually had his own branch line. About half a kilometre from Wootton Station, from where we are now, you'll see that a track curves away to our right, goes around the village of Wootton, and it stops about 1.5 miles or 2.5 kilometres away on the Kingswood Road. It was built to service several farms that are in or around Wootton. It was never upgraded, and by 1898 it was derelict, but it was still marked on the map, so I have put the tracks in. Coming off this line was a little siding to the very first farm, which was called Church Farm. So I think that had the name Church Siding, but somehow the name Church Siding got applied to the junction of the two lines, which we are just about to come up to, and it appears there on the Ordnance Survey Map, which also describes the branch as the Kingswood branch of the Wootton Tramway. And here is the Kingswood branch curving off to our right. And they built a water tower here, and I'd mentioned the water shortages before. As this was the nearest convenient place to the village, it is likely that the trains used to stop here to let off the villagers. In fact, they probably stopped exactly here where it crosses the footpath. As far as I can tell, there was no station. Some people like to think there was, and some maps which show the Brill branch in the modern London Underground map style put a station here. They really shouldn't. We're going around the village of Wootton, so let's talk about the Duke of Buckingham, whose stately home and vast estate are in the middle of the village. To give him his full name, Richard Plantagenet Campbell Temple Nugent Bridges Chandos Grenville, 3rd Duke of Buckingham and Chandos. He was the Secretary of State for the Colonies, 1867-8. He was the Governor of Madras, 1870-80, well in with the politicians and leading lights of Victorian society. He was born 1823 and he died in 1889, aged 65, and was buried here in the family church at Wootton. His family used to own Stowe, which is a magnificent house north of Buckingham and well worth visiting, but he got into financial difficulties and much of it was sold or let out. The Duke managed to restore some of the family fortunes, and he owned 10,500 acres of prime agricultural land by 1885. He had some daughters, we didn't have any sons, and the rules were that the title had to go to a son, so the line of the Duke of Buckingham ended there, but his nephew inherited and was able to inherit as the Earl Temple. His house, I'm going to turn the cab view around to the right, and we'll have a look and see if we can glimpse the house. In fact, there, it's more or less in the middle. I plonked a big building there to show where the house was, and of course it's actually still there. Built around 1710 in English Baroque style, it was the home of the Grenville arm of the Duke's family. It was rebuilt after a fire in 1820 by the renowned architect Sir John Soane. And it's now part owned by Tony and Sherry Blair. Only about 400 acres of the original grounds stayed with the house. The rest was sold for farmland soon after World War II. We are approaching a house called Tame Lodge, and there was a rule originally that drivers had to slow down to 5 miles an hour when they passed this house, so I am guessing that perhaps a family member lived in it. Little road off to the right which goes right through the estate, and another unmanned level crossing. Just to say here a little more about the extension to Oxford. And it was almost inevitably Sir Edward Watkin who was the genius behind the Met's expansion out of London and the creation of the Great Central Railway, and indeed the very first Channel Tunnel. He was the man who planned a direct route from London to Oxford, linking the Met with the Aylesbury and Buckingham Railway, and then using the Buckinghamshire Railway to reach Oxford. Parliamentary approval for that particular route could not be obtained. The Met then acquired the Aylesbury and Buckingham Railway, as I've covered in my previous videos. Duke of Buckingham then developed his own plan to take the Brill Tramway, which at that time was still his private property, out to Oxford, and he got parliamentary permission in 1883, but it was too expensive to proceed. After his death, which was in 1889, a revised plan was formed by a newly created company called the Oxford and Aylesbury Tramroad Company, and the idea being to keep the light railway aspects of the Brill Tramway, but still push on to Oxford. The O&A bought the tramway and obtained financial backing from Ferdinand Rothschild, whose condition was that the Metropolitan, which was interested in this project, built a station close to Waterston. And they did that in 1897. They built the station at Waterston Manor. And at this time, the name of this line on the Ordnance Survey Map is the Oxford and Aylesbury Tramroad, although it wasn't a tram road, and it didn't go to Aylesbury, and it never got to Oxford. Watkin was now too old and ill to influence the railways he had brought together. The directors of the Met had no real interest in a light rail route. And so, when the Met took over the running of the Oxford and Aylesbury Tramroad, the Brill Tramway, in 1899, which is exactly the time I've set this layout, the Oxford scheme died. We're now approaching a little station called Wood Siding. And this was built on the edge of the very large woodland that surrounds the Duke of Buckingham's estate, and the only reason to have a station here would have been to shift the timber that was being produced from the woods. There's nothing else anywhere near here, just a few cottages, which would have been cottages on the estate occupied by either aged retainers or maybe old family members, or more likely farm managers and labourers. There's a road to our left which runs up to Brill. On the right, the woods of the Duke of Buckingham's estate. In 1910, the Great Western Railway built a new direct line from London to Birmingham, bypassing Oxford. It went straight through the woods at Wootton. Here, in a deep cutting, actually ran underneath Wood Siding Station. They put a bridge over it to carry the Brill Branch over this cutting, and they rebuilt Wood Siding Station partially on top of it. Today that line is still in use, but of Wood Siding Station and the Brill Branch, just the foundations of the bridge are left. Coming up to the Brill Brickworks, the large building you can see on our left, and there appears to be a deer escaping from the Duke's estate running across the tracks there. Built soon after the Duke of Buckingham died, it probably seemed like a smart idea for the estate to have its own brickworks, and the Ordnance Survey Map shows a very large site, which today is an industrial park here. A siding led into it, and it was sunken into the ground to make loading wagons much easier. But it was not a commercial success. It was eventually taken over by another local businessman who was one of the trustees of the Oxford and Aylesbury Tramroad Company. And it was turned into a different sort of business altogether. And we're still passing through the woods of the Duke of Buckingham's estate. I should say the estate belonging to the Earl Temple, because as we've already explained, the Duke had been dead several years before this layout is set. And soon coming into view, you'll see the hill on which the village of Brill is sited. It's to our left. It rises about nearly 300 feet, 90 metres anyway, above the plain. Today's population is about 1,100, and that's believed to be roughly similar to what it was in 1900. It is 1.3 kilometres from the station to the centre of the village, so it was a long slog for anyone who could not afford a horse and cart. And again, slogging up that hill, which was quite steep, in the dark and wet in the winter, I think would have been quite unpleasant. Brill Station is in front of us, and I'm going to read a rather sad note. This comes from the report of the London Passenger Transport Board, and that board had only been formed in 1933, took over all of London's commuter railways, including the Metropolitan, and they said the train services provided on the Brill branch of the Metropolitan and GC joint line have resulted in a loss of roughly £4,000 per annum. The traffic was exceedingly light, the total number of passenger journeys in the year being 18,000, or fewer than 50 per day. And of course that was spread over their 8 passenger services. The annual goods and mineral traffic amounted to some 7,600 tonnes only, representing about 20 tonnes per day. There has been no development in the traffic, and as, owing to its volume, it seemed quite feasible for it to be dealt with by means of road conveyance, the board and the LNER, who had taken over from the GCR in the Great Reorganisation of 1923, jointly took steps to give notice for the closing of this branch line. And that's the end of their report, and that was the end of the branch line. The London Passenger Transport Board killed it off. The Oxford and Aylesbury Tramway Company, which I mentioned earlier, took over the railway a few years after the death of the Duke of Buckingham, and which then had ceded the operations of the railway to the Met in 1899. It continued to own it until the end. And in 1935, once the Met ceased operating the railway, it sold off the rails, which had some value, sheds and any other equipment, which were pretty well worthless, and then having no other business whatsoever, it was wound up. Also in that year, in 1935, the Met stopped running north of Quainton, which began the long retreat, which ended in 1961, when Amersham became the end of the Metropolitan line. Well, that concludes the video. Thank you very much for watching, and the next one will make the return journey, but we'll do it at the end of the afternoon when everything will look extremely pleasant. Thank you very much.